Okay, think about how you navigate the internet every single day. Who actually decides what you see
Mhm.
and what happens when that power gets used to, well, silence certain people?
It's a huge question, really. These platforms we use all the time, they've become these enormous gatekeepers, haven't they?
Exactly. And that's precisely the complex territory we're getting into today.
Hmm.
We've got this whole stack of sources you've shared, articles, research notes, even bits from an audio piece.
Hmm.
And this material really focuses on a specific period, looking at major tech companies taking pretty significant actions against various figures, especially the deplatforming of Alex Jones.
Right. So our goal here in this deep dive is really to unpack all that material.
Yeah.
You want to, understand the timeline the sources lay out, look at the reasons the platforms actually gave for these bans,
Yeah.
and really dig into the concerns your sources are raising about things like, well, hate speech, platform responsibility, and what free expression even means now in this digital world.
Totally. Because these sources, they don't just list events. They really try to get into the why.
Mhm.
And they raise some pretty fundamental questions about the rules of the digital town square, I guess, and who gets to make those rules.
It's a look at this constantly changing landscape of online moderation and, well, what impact that might have on just public conversation.
So let's just jump right in then. The sources we're looking at, they seem to pinpoint a key moment that really kicked off the major trouble for Alex Jones on these platforms.
Yeah, they do.
They point back to a video from February suggesting David Hogg was a crisis actor.
Yes, that specific video, according to the material, that's what triggered YouTube's first big move. They pulled the video, gave Jones a strike,
Right.
citing their hoax video policy. And the sources mention YouTube and also CNN were saying, that showing it repeatedly amounted to harassment, to bullying.
And the sources highlight something really interesting there about CNN's reaction back then. Apparently, they were quite vocal, complaining that Jones only got one strike. And they even admitted, the sources say, to actively flagging his content, basically trying to help push his account towards, more penalties.
Which, as the sources observe, kind of gives you a little window into the mindset or maybe the strategy of some media outlets towards Jones at that specific point.
Yeah. And the sources describe how after that, there seemed to be this concerted push from various social justice advocates and media publications to get Jones fully deplatformed.
Right.
Lots of articles started popping up accusing him of all sorts of things, racism, harassment, even harming children through his conspiracy theories.
And the sources make a really specific point here. It's almost a bit meta.
Okay.
They note that some journalists writing about this use certain language to criticize the tech companies, like referring to them as having a learning disability for not banning Jones faster. And the sources kind of juxtapose this, suggesting, well, this is language that social justice advocates might call a microaggression in another context, highlighting what the sources see as maybe an inconsistency in judging language, depending on who the target is.
Interesting observation. So this first incident, the Hogg video and the YouTube strike,
Yeah.
that really lit the fuse, according to
Oh.
the sources, because, well, here's where things just escalated.
Hmm.
Dramatically and fast.
Oh, absolutely. The sources lay out this incredibly rapid sequence of actions, like boom, 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 across multiple platforms in just a couple of weeks.
Okay, walk us through it.
So July 24th, YouTube removes 4 more InfoWars videos, issues a second strike,
Okay.
and this time the reasons cited, according to the sources, were hate speech and also promoting child endangerment. And they shut down his live streaming too.
Wow. Okay. Then what?
Then just 3 days later, July 27th, Facebook jumps in. They give Jones a 30-day ban, take down 4 videos. But the sources note here that Facebook wasn't super specific about which policies were violated. It seemed, the sources suggest, heavily driven by user reports coming in.
And the sources mention Jones's reaction to that first wave.
Yeah, they mentioned he did a live stream, basically framing it as a media conspiracy against conservative voices.
Okay.
And the sources then point out how the media covered that, often labeling Jones right-wing, while, according to the sources, maybe not mentioning their own earlier calls for him to be banned.
Huh. And didn't the New York Times weigh in too?
They did. The sources mentioned the Times called these initial actions a slap on the wrist, clearly feeling the platforms hadn't gone far enough yet.
So the pressure was building. What happened next?
Well, the deplatforming just kept rolling. Spotify removed several InfoWars podcast episodes.
Okay.
Then Stitcher went even further, removed all of his podcasts entirely.
All of them. Wow. Their reason.
The sources say Stitcher cited him having harassed or allowed harassment, and encouraging damaging activity.
Right. Okay, who was
Yeah.
next?
Apple. August 5th, they removed 5 out of the 6 InfoWars podcasts they carried. The reason given there, according to the sources, hate speech.
So hate speech again?
Yep. And then the very next day, August 6th, Facebook escalated again. They removed 4 pages linked to Jones.
Okay, and the reasons this time? Still hate speech.
Actually, no. This is where the sources really focus on the shifting terms. Facebook apparently cited glorified violence and dehumanizing language.
Dehumanizing language, so not quite the same thing.
Exactly. And the sources argue this suggests the definitions felt kind of fluid or were maybe being adjusted on the fly.
Which connects back to that point the sources made earlier, right?
Yeah.
About the lack of a clear operational definition for hate speech.
Precisely. They bring up Mark Zuckerberg himself stating Facebook didn't really have one.
Okay, so after Facebook's page removals,
Then YouTube went all the way, removed the entire InfoWars channel, reason cited, back to hate speech.
back to hate speech.
Wow.
Any others in this initial flurry?
The last one mentioned in this specific timeline from your sources is Vimeo. They also removed InfoWars, citing discriminatory and hateful content.
Okay.
And there's a little detail mentioned from Business Insider in the sources there, suggesting the Vimeo ban was actually pushed by employee complaints, not necessarily user reports.
Interesting. So just this incredible cascade across almost every major platform, citing slightly different things each time, all packed into a few weeks. What about Twitter? The sources mentioned them too.
They did. They note that Jack Dorsey, the CEO then, had actually tweeted not long before that banning Jones just for political bias wouldn't be right.
Right, I remember that.
But then, shortly after all these other bans, Twitter did give Jones a 7-day suspension. It was over a video.
And the reason.
Twitter claimed it incited violence, but the sources described that claim as, quote, flimsy, suggesting the justification felt a bit debatable to them.
Okay, so that timeline laid out in the sources is just striking. Widespread action, varied reasons, some seeming a bit vague or shifting. But the sources argue this wasn't just about Alex Jones.
Exactly. This is where they really lean into that slippery slope concern. They start listing other people, other groups, who face platform actions around the same time.
Okay, like who?
Well, they point to Candace Owens getting a Twitter suspension. It was for some tweets where she'd swapped words around, apparently to make a point about language standards.
Okay.
Or a conservative writer, Elizabeth Cantor. The sources say she was suspended for a tweet that was actually supporting someone else, and she had to delete it to get her account back.
Just for supporting someone. Wow.
The sources also mention Scott Horton and Daniel McAdams getting suspended, but those were later called accidents by the platforms.
Accidents, right?
And then they detail bans hitting people like Peter Van Buren, Gavin McInnes, and the group The Proud Boys. The sources note they were labeled violent extremists that condone violence. And they specifically contrast this with Antifa accounts, which the sources observe were generally still allowed on the platforms at that time.
Gotcha. Okay, I know.
Tommy Robinson kicked off Instagram around then.
Okay.
And the sources highlight a case of a trans YouTuber who got banned from YouTube. The reason given was hate speech in videos that were critical of social justice ideas.
So criticism being labeled hate speech there, according to the sources.
That's how they frame it. And even things just related to Jones seemed affected.
Like what?
An H3H3 live stream, apparently it got deleted right in the middle while they were talking about Alex Jones.
Seriously. Midstream.
Yeah. And the Ron Gibson channel, which the sources say was archiving some of Jones's old videos, that got removed too.
Huh. And Facebook had other examples too, didn't they? Not just Jones.
Right. The sources point to the platform's own system flagging the Declaration of Independence as hate speech at one point.
Get out.
Yep. And blocking a gospel music group's paid video ad, calling it political content.
Wow. Okay, so bringing all these examples together, the sources use them to argue what exactly?
To argue that it looks like a pattern, it feeds that slippery slope idea that the tools, and maybe more importantly, the subjective standards used against someone like Jones, could easily be turned on a much wider range of people and content, not just the really extreme stuff.
Right. Which leads us straight into the core criticism running through all this material you shared.
Exactly. The big problem, as the sources see it, is these platforms operating without a really clear, consistently applied operational definition for terms like hate speech.
And the sources argue that vagueness is actually the key problem.
Yes. They argue it's because there's no clear definition that the term can be applied arbitrarily. It lets platforms, or maybe groups pressuring platforms, use the label without much accountability, targeting people they just don't like, potentially, rather than using objective measures.
And they brought up Zuckerberg's own comments again here.
Yeah, his admission that Facebook doesn't have an operational definition is presented as like Exhibit A. If the definition isn't fixed, the sources argue that it must be subjective and open to influence or change.
And the sources try to connect this online stuff to things happening offline, too.
They do. They draw parallels to conservative speakers getting shut down or run off college campuses. They specifically mention Evergreen State College.
Okay.
They also talk about instances where, as they describe it, even liberals seen as sympathetic but not extreme enough face online pile-ons pressure to apologize publicly. And they include that specific real-world example of Candace Owens being confronted physically by people identified as Antifa members while she was just trying to get coffee.
Right. And there was that quote from a Facebook spokesperson the sources highlighted.
Yes, that's a key point for them. She apparently told reporters that the company's goal, the actual goal behind their hate speech policies, is to change people's behavior.
Wow.
And the sources immediately jump on that, asking, should that really be the goal of a social media platform? Changing behavior.
Yeah, that's a big question.
And should platforms or maybe mobs of users applying pressure really be the ones deciding what even counts as hate speech in the first place?
They also bring in some history, don't they? About the term itself.
Yeah, they point out that hate speech as a concept has historically been misused, sometimes against groups it was meant to protect, but often just by people in power against voices they didn't like. The sources are pretty skeptical that today's tech platforms are somehow immune to falling into those same patterns of subjective enforcement.
So the core tension the sources highlight is this. Platforms need rules, obviously, but the danger they see is when those rules are vague, subjective,
and potentially influenced by outside pressure or internal biases, leading to really inconsistent results.
Okay. So given all those pretty serious concerns raised in the material, did the sources offer any potential alternatives? Like how should platforms decide what's allowed?
They do explore a couple of ideas. One major suggestion is to rely more on established legal definitions, things like libel, slander.
Okay, why that approach?
Well, the reasoning presented in the sources is that objective standards, backed by actual law, are just much harder to abuse than these vague subjective standards that seem to depend on who feels offended by what at any given moment.
So it provides a clearer, maybe more stable framework.
That's the argument they make, yeah. Tying it to existing legal precedent gives clearer lines.
Is there another suggestion?
A much simpler one, also mentioned, is basically if you, the user, are offended by something, just block it yourself and move on.
Put the control back in the individual's hands, essentially.
Exactly. That's the idea presented. Less reliance on the platform or, collective outrage deciding what everyone else gets to see.
So boiling it down, the sources reiterate their main point.
Yeah, they circle back to say, look, companies absolutely have the right to run their platforms how they want, to distance themselves from users they don't want associated with them. But the problem, as highlighted by all these events documented in the sources, is doing that using these really vague, subjective standards like hate speech without clear definitions or consistent, transparent enforcement. That's the core issue they raise.
Okay, so stepping back from all this, what does it all mean? This deep dive into the sources has really shown us, well, a period of incredibly fast, widespread deplatforming.
Yeah, with platforms giving all these different reasons that, at least according to the sources, sometimes felt unclear or seemed to change from one band to the next.
It definitely brings that central concern from the material into sharp focus, the issue around not having a clear working definition for terms like hate speech.
And the potential power that vagueness gives platforms or maybe influential groups pressuring them to really shape what gets seen and heard online.
And these actions, they aren't presented in the sources as just isolated incidents, are they?
Not at all. The sources position them as possibly part of a wider trend, that whole slippery slope idea that could end up affecting lots of different voices, different kinds of content.
With dynamics that might even spill over from online spaces into the real world, as some of the examples suggested.
Yeah, the material really makes you grapple with just how hard it is to manage speech on these huge global platforms, especially when the rules seem so subjective, or at least applied in ways that are hard to predict consistently.
Which leaves us, and you, with a pretty significant question. one that stems directly from the issues these sources wrestle with.
Right.
If platforms aren't necessarily relying on clear legal standards like libel or slander, and if they aren't providing clearly defined, consistently applied rules themselves, then how can any user really know where the lines are?
And maybe more importantly, what does this evolving landscape actually mean for who gets to speak and ultimately who gets heard in our digital public square?